Fourth maze, blue. The steady rhythm of steam, the creaking and grinding of machines. A metallic taste in the air, the smell of wool. The activity in the factory provided welcome warmth as the weather cooled. It would soon be winter. Ambra pretended to concentrate on her work, all the while keeping a sideways eye on the goings-on in Mr. Victor's textile factory. The boss man was up from London today, inspecting his factory and workforce. With his black top hat perched atop his dark, grey-flecked hair and his navy cape flourishing around his legs as he strolled along, his presence struck awe in the women who earned their way in the world working for him. The city was an extraordinary contrast to Ambra's previous life in the village, where her kin worked from sun-up to sunset to benefit the lord of the manor. There, the big man not only took the fruits of their labour, but they needed permission from the master to make any decisions about their own lives. Fed up with life in the country, Ambra had fled to the city looking for adventure and opportunity. She had found routine and discipline. Thankfully, she had also found work that yielded her some money in return for her 10-hour days. It was enough to keep her sheltered and fed at the local boarding house for women, week in, week out. On Sunday mornings she went to church and then enjoyed the freedom of one glorious afternoon to do as she pleased. Tomorrow, she might take a simple picnic to a park, or read a book, or walk by the lake. It was a long and tiring week in between those afternoons, but that precious time was not plagued by worry about where the next meal was coming from, or whether it would be safe to sleep that night. And if she met her quota, sometimes there was a bonus, like a bag of potatoes or some cakes to take home. It was worth working hard to make sure she could enjoy fresh produce and baked goods. And it was worth going to church knowing that her work ethic would stand her in good stead in the eyes of God. The church had taught her the way to a blissful afterlife in heaven was through hard work now. Ambra wasn't entirely sure about that, but why take the risk? In any case, she had little in the way of other options. Without warning, a rolled-up newspaper whacked Ambra in the back of the head. "Lightstone, stop daydreaming and get back to work," growled the supervisor. Ambra saw that Mr. Victor was drawing nearer to where she was working. She put her head down. In her hands, threads of blue, red and orange fibre turned into wonderful, warm, soft wool on the loom. Over time, as she'd worked, she'd realised that the method of making wool with these machines was inefficient. Ambra had often made woolen garments and clothing in the village entirely by hand. She had even spun the fibre into thread. There were 4 different ways she had determined would make the process quicker and save her. The day before, she had tried to raise this with the supervisor, who had yelled at her to mind her own business and get on with the work she was employed to do. As Mr. Victor made his way closer, she gathered her resolve to dare raise her views with the boss man himself. He might like her ideas and adopt them in his factory. It would save him money. She fantasised she might even get a small reward. If she could find a minute to speak to him without her supervisor within earshot. She glanced up and caught the eye of her co-worker, Elizabeth, on the other side of the factory floor, and gave her a discreet nod. Within seconds, Elizabeth had upended the machine she was working on with a loud crash. The supervisor excused himself from Mr. Victor and rushed away towards Elizabeth's feigned accident. Ambra gathered her courage, rose, turned to Mr. Victor, and gave a small curtsy. "Sir, if I may have a word?" Mr. Victor looked surprised but not angry, so she continued on, launching into her ideas for improving production practices. She was halfway through her spiel, which she'd been practicing for the last fortnight ever since learning of the owner's impending visit, when she felt a presence behind her. She stopped mid-sentence and turned around to see the supervisor glowering at her. "Lightstone, what the devil do you think you're doing? It's not your place to tell the owner how to run his business. Sit down and get back to work, and no bonus for you this week." The whole factory floor seemed to have paused, watching as she was berated. Face flushed, Ambra slunk back onto her work stool, as Mr. Victor and her supervisor walked to the factory exit. But as her supervisor went outside to hold the door open for Mr. Victor, the boss man turned back and looked in her direction momentarily. Ambra's breath caught in her throat. Their eyes met. Then he gave her a wink. A smile played around the corners of Ambra's mouth. As the door closed, she and several others raced over to the window and peered out. Mr. Victor had climbed into a grand carriage drawn by 4 white horses. Ambra could only see the top of his cane and his hands resting on it as the carriage drew away. Her eyes followed the carriage until it was out of sight. As she went back to her station, she thought, if only I had the means, I could open my own factory. I'd treat my workforce well, and I know as much or more about wool making as these men do. The entrepreneurial spark caught fire in her head. She resolved to spend tomorrow afternoon in the library. The supervisor came storming back in, fuming. He strode up to Ambra, continuing his tirade. Ambra knew she had made an impression on the boss man, and that he would almost certainly adopt some of her ideas. It made no sense not to. Perhaps she had even made an ally. Her supervisor was threatening her with disciplinary action, eyes popping, spittle flying out of his mouth. Ambra found his face comical and tried, but failed, to suppress her amusement. The supervisor's face turned apoplectic, and he raised the back of his hand to her. But before he could strike, the world dissolved again, and Ambra was back in the cave, bathed in blue light. Once again, she felt a sense of relief at having left the world she was in. But where on earth was this mad maze taking her? The lanterns mutated from deep blue to pale aqua, then glowed a vivid orange.